They think I can't hear them when they stand in the hallway and whisper, but walls in this house are thinner than they believe, and words carry further when the people speaking them don't imagine the person they're talking about could be listening. I was sitting on the bed, folding a sweater that had belonged to my late husband, when I heard Lisa's voice, low but sharp, the way you slice into a ripe piece of fruit without warning. "She's like a dog," she said. "You feed her and she stays." I froze with the sweater half folded in my lap, the words hanging in the air like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. My son didn't answer right away. There was a pause, and then he muttered something about patience, about how I wouldn't be here forever. I couldn't hear the rest, because a door closed somewhere down the hall, but that one sentence had already settled in my bones, heavy and cold. They didn't know that I'd been watching them as much as they'd been watching me, and they didn't know that the little porcelain angel Lisa had put on the bookshelf opposite my bed was not a harmless decoration, but a lens, barely the size of a button, its red light so faint it would disappear in daylight. I had seen it weeks ago, but I said nothing, because there are moments in life when speaking too soon robs you of the only power you have left, and I needed time to understand just how far they were willing to go. I am 81 years old, and I live in my son's house not because I am destitute or because I have nowhere else to go, but because 3 months ago, after a bad fall in my kitchen, Adam insisted that I shouldn't be alone. At first, I thought it was kindness. He came to see me in the hospital, took my hand, and said, "You've looked after everyone for so long, Mom. Let us take care of you for a change." It sounded like love, and I wanted to believe it. I didn't notice, at least not immediately, how quickly I was turned from a mother into a guest, from a woman with her own home into someone accommodated out of obligation. They gave me the small room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that faces the neighbor's wall instead of the street, and Lisa made a show of buying fresh curtains and a new bedspread in a cheerful yellow that I would never have chosen for myself. She said it would brighten the space, but it only made the shadows more obvious. They told me to rest, to enjoy the quiet, to let them handle the big things now, which seemed to include decisions about my meals, my medication, and even my mail. I told myself not to be ungrateful. I told myself they meant well. I told myself a lot of things, because sometimes lying to yourself feels safer than facing the truth about the people you've loved the longest. The day I noticed the camera, it was by accident. Lisa had been rearranging things in my room while I was in the garden, and when I came back in, I saw the little porcelain angel on the bookshelf tilted at an odd angle, its tiny eyes catching the light in a way that made me pause. I've always had sharp eyes for details, once a nurse, always a nurse, and something about it was wrong. I picked it up, turned it over, and there it was. A small dark lens embedded in the base, with a slit so narrow you'd think it was just part of the glaze. I didn't touch it again, just set it back exactly as it had been, and made a mental note. I told myself I'd wait, that there was power in patience, and that if they had gone so far as to watch me, I would be the one to decide when the watching ended. I have lived too long through too many losses and betrayals to act out of shock. I have learned that you get one real move in moments like these, and if you use it too soon, it's wasted. From that day forward, I noticed more. Lisa was careful never to say certain things when she was in my room, but in the hallway, in the kitchen, in the living room when they thought I was upstairs napping, her voice was unfiltered. I heard her complain to Adam about how much longer I might be with them, about how much of her time I took up, about how I left little messes that made her feel like she was living in a nursing home. She said she worried I'd forget to turn off the stove or take the wrong pills, though she never once asked me if I'd like her help cooking or sorting my medication. Adam's answers were quieter, sometimes weary, sometimes complicit. He told her I was still sharp, still capable, but his voice lacked conviction, and he didn't stop her from speaking about me as though I weren't family, but a problem to be managed. Once, late at night, I heard them arguing in the kitchen. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard Lisa's voice, tight with frustration, say, "We need to know what she's doing in there." Adam didn't argue, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I thought about confronting them. I imagined walking into the living room one evening, picking up the porcelain angel and setting it down on the coffee table in silence, letting them squirm. But something in me resisted. This wasn't just about the camera. This was about what they had already decided I was, someone to be monitored, contained, and eventually forgotten. If I confronted them, they would lie. They would apologize. They would remove the camera and find another way to keep me small. No, I decided. I wouldn't warn them. I would watch them watch me until I found the right way to turn the tables. My mother used to say that people will show you exactly who they are if you let them talk long enough. I planned to let them talk. That afternoon, after I heard Lisa call me a dog, I put the sweater away and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the creaks of the house, the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the muffled sound of a television from the living room. I thought about all the years I'd spent putting other people's needs before my own, how I'd given Adam the best of my time, my energy, my savings, and how easily he had allowed his wife to speak of me as though I were a stray they'd taken in. The bitterness rose in me like slow smoke, and I felt something shift, not a decision exactly, but the recognition that the ground beneath our relationship had already crumbled. I would not repair it. I would not explain myself. I would not even warn them that I knew. I would wait, and when the time came, I would make sure that whatever they had done to me would be seen, not just by me, but by everyone who thought they knew who Adam and Lisa really were. So I smoothed the bedspread, adjusted the porcelain angel so its hidden eye faced the bed exactly as before, and I smiled to myself in a way I hadn't in years. They wanted to watch me? Then they would get a show they could never control. The moment the screen flickered to life was the moment I realized that the walls in this house no longer offered me privacy, no longer protected the dignity of my years. It was late evening, the kind of quiet when the world feels like it's holding its breath, and I was sitting in my small bedroom, the one they insisted I call mine, though I knew it was only a concession, a space set aside like a drawer in a cabinet, something to be managed and tucked away. I'd just finished folding a few clothes, the familiar motion grounding me, when my phone, which I had recently learned to use better than I ever thought I would, buzzed with a notification from the family group chat. Usually it was a flood of messages about mundane things, grocery lists, reminders about doctor's appointments, the occasional joke I didn't quite understand anymore. But this time, the thumbnail was different. It showed a blurry, grainy image of a room I recognized immediately. It was my room, the same bedspread, the same faded curtains, the same porcelain angel on the bookshelf. And in that image, I saw myself, sitting there, folding clothes. The shock was so sharp it stole the breath from my lungs. I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling, and then the live feed began. There they were, Adam and Lisa, arguing, their voices low but tense enough to shatter the fragile quiet I had built around myself. The camera was fixed at an angle that captured the doorway and part of the living room beyond, the sofa where I usually sat to read, the small kitchen table where I ate my solitary meals. I listened without moving, unable to look away. Lisa's voice was harsh, cold with irritation as she said, "I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending." She's slipping, and it's getting worse every day. Adam's reply was soft but carried a weight of exhaustion. "I know, but we have to be careful. It's not just about her. The family, people are watching. They want to see we're doing the right thing." The right thing. As if what they were doing was some kind of service, rather than the slow erasure of a woman they no longer wanted to see. I watched as Lisa bent down and picked something off the floor, my hearing aid, the one I had been struggling to adjust to, and held it up with a sneer. "She's losing it. Left this on the floor again. How long before she forgets who we are?" Adam shook his head, voice softening. "Don't say that." "We promised Dad we'd take care of her." "Taking care of her?" Lisa repeated bitterly. "Watching her like a prisoner, locking her away in that room like a child, streaming her every move to the family group. That's taking care?" Her words were pointed, accusation slipping through her carefully maintained facade. They didn't know I was watching the stream. They thought the camera was secret, but this time it was I who held the unseen power. The family group chat erupted with messages immediately after the video was shared, though not by me. It was a cousin, then an aunt, a niece, all reacting with a mixture of horror and disbelief, sending urgent texts that no one in the house seemed to acknowledge. My own son and daughter-in-law were oblivious, or pretending to be. I realized then that the camera was not only a tool for monitoring me, it was a weapon for controlling everyone else's narrative. They wanted to tell the story of a frail old woman slipping into forgetfulness, a burden that had to be managed delicately behind closed doors. But the truth, the raw, unfiltered truth, was leaking out. I didn't have to say a word. The camera did it for me, showing their true faces, the cracks beneath the polished veneer of care. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding but mind clear. In that moment, a part of me that I thought had long since been silenced stirred. A steady, quiet flame of rebellion that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with survival. I remembered the years I had spent raising Adam, the nights I stayed awake worrying about him, the sacrifices I had made quietly so that he might have a life better than mine. And here they were, reducing me to a subject of covert observation, stripping away every shred of dignity I had left. It was not just betrayal, it was erasure. But I was still here, watching, listening, waiting. I decided not to confront them yet. That night, I lay awake long after the house had fallen silent, replaying the conversation I had witnessed, listening to the tone of voices that were usually so careful to be gentle when I was near. It was as if, behind closed doors, the truth spilled out, raw and unfiltered, exposing the real cost of their care. They saw me as a problem to be managed, a chore to be endured, a fading shadow of the woman who had once been the center of their lives. But what they did not see, and could not see, was the quiet gathering of strength inside me. The slow turning of the tide that would soon rise and sweep away the pretense. Over the following days, the tension in the house shifted. Lisa's smile became tighter, her eyes darting suspiciously whenever she passed my door. Adam's tone grew more careful, his patience thinner. They began to check my room more often, rearranging things as if to erase my presence, to remind me subtly that I was no longer in control here. But I watched. I noted their patterns, their silences, the moments when they thought I was not paying attention, and I prepared. I found an old smartphone in a drawer, one I had kept from before they moved me here, and with trembling fingers, I set up a new account, a new app that would become my shield and my sword. I would use their own tools against them. One evening, when Lisa and Adam were arguing loudly in the kitchen, this time about money and how much longer they could afford to keep me here, I quietly opened the Livestream app and began to broadcast. Not to strangers, not to distant watchers, but to the family group chat where their faces now wore expressions of shock and shame. The stream was raw, unedited. It was not a plea for sympathy or forgiveness. It was an unveiling. I let them speak, unguarded and unprepared, knowing that their words would shatter the carefully constructed image they presented to the world. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Messages flooded in from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, some expressing concern, others anger, and some even disbelief that Adam and Lisa could behave this way. The household was thrown into chaos. Lisa's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Adam's expression grew haunted, as if the walls they had built to hide the truth were crumbling before their eyes. Yet none of this mattered to me anymore. I had reclaimed a piece of myself with that one act. I had shattered the silence that had kept me invisible for too long. I packed a small bag that night, careful not to wake anyone. I left a note on my pillow, simple but firm. "You should have asked for help. I would have given it. But you asked the wrong way." Then I stepped out into the cool night air, the city quiet around me, and for the first time in months, I felt the sharp edge of freedom cut through the years of loneliness and control. I didn't know where I was going, only that I was moving toward a place where I could be myself again, unwatched, unjudged, and unafraid. That was the beginning of the end. The moment I stopped being a subject of secret surveillance and became a woman who told her own story, on her own terms, and in her own time. After that night, when I first revealed the hidden camera through the live stream to the family group, the air in the house seemed to change. Not with the warmth I might have hoped for, but with a creeping coldness that settled into every corner and crevice as if the walls themselves were turning against me. The quiet control that had once defined my days became a fragile, trembling tension that flickered beneath every glance, every word spoken too softly, every door closed just a little too firmly. I watched them closely. Adam, Lisa, even the occasional visit from the neighbors or distant relatives. Each encounter marked by a mixture of restraint and accusation, as though the simple fact of my presence reminded them of a fault they had never been willing to admit aloud. The house no longer felt like a refuge, nor even a temporary shelter, but rather a cage painted with the illusion of care. In the days following the live stream, they removed the porcelain angel from my room, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they found another way to keep watch. The cameras might vanish, but the eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were never far. The family group chat, once a place for shared memories and mundane chatter, had become a battleground of silent messages and guarded comments. I saw the shock and confusion ripple through relatives who had no idea what had been hidden behind the polished smiles of Adam and Lisa. Some reached out with hesitant phone calls or quiet texts, but most remained distant, unwilling or unable to intervene in a family matter that had been carefully kept behind closed doors for years. Inside the house, the subtle erosion of my autonomy continued with a precision that felt almost surgical. Lisa took over more decisions, her voice growing louder in the spaces where mine once belonged. She began scheduling my appointments without consulting me, adjusting my medication dosages and timing under the guise of professional advice from doctors she claimed to have spoken to. She monitored my diet rigidly, removing foods I had enjoyed for decades and replacing them with tasteless substitutes she called healthier options. Adam caught between his wife's forcefulness and the flickers of guilt that crossed his face when he saw the fatigue in mine grew quieter and more distant. He stopped calling me Mom in conversation, instead referring to me in third person as the patient or the situation. I kept my routine as best I could, rising early to brew a cup of tea, folding my clothes, reading the newspaper, and tending to the small garden in the backyard whenever the weather allowed. These rituals were my anchors, the last threads of normalcy in a world that was slowly unraveling. But with each passing day, I felt my presence shrinking in the eyes of those who were supposed to love me. The subtle glances exchanged in my absence, the way my voice was talked over or ignored at the dinner table, the hushed conversations abruptly ending when I entered a room, they all chipped away at the woman I once was, replacing her with a shadow that belonged to no one but herself. The hidden camera was gone, but the surveillance did not stop. I found myself watched through the kitchen window by the neighbors, whose smiles never reached their eyes. My phone was accidentally left unattended with messages from Lisa checking in on my activities. And one day, I discovered a tracking device taped beneath the armrest of my favorite chair. The betrayal was not only in the spying, but in the realization that my every movement was anticipated, controlled, and judged. I was no longer living. I was existing under a microscope, My dignity filtered through layers of suspicion and fear. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Adam and Lisa that chilled me more than any camera ever could. They were discussing options, words I had dreaded for years, words that always meant loss, displacement, or surrender. Lisa spoke of assisted living facilities and the cost of care, her tone clinical and detached, while Adam hesitated, caught between obligation and reluctance. I did not confront them then. Instead, I retreated deeper into myself, gathering strength in silence, letting their plans wash over me like a cold wave I could not yet resist. I knew I needed a way out, but I also knew that any sudden move would only confirm their fears and tighten their grip. I began to watch the patterns of the house with new eyes. The times when they left doors unlocked, the lapses in attention during busy days, the moments when exhaustion made their vigilance slip. I memorized the route from the back door to the garden gate, noting where the locks were rusted or easy to pick. I found an old phone hidden beneath the sofa cushions, one that did not connect to the family network and had a battery that still held a charge. It became my lifeline, a secret bridge between the cage I inhabited and the world beyond. With it, I contacted a cousin who lived 2 states away, someone I trusted with fragments of my story and a plea for help disguised as a casual check-in. Each day was a delicate balance of endurance and quiet defiance. I learned to smile when I was weary, to nod when I disagreed, to remain patient when I wanted to shout. The meals I ate were smaller, the walks shorter, but the resolve inside me grew stronger. I started to reclaim small freedoms, a book bought with my own money, a letter written in secret to a granddaughter who had begun to ask questions no one else dared answer, a phone call made when no one was watching. These acts of rebellion were tiny, almost invisible, but they built a foundation beneath the brittle surface of my imposed helplessness. The house, once filled with laughter and the noise of a growing family, had become a stage where I played the role of the forgotten elder. The neighbors asked polite questions I answered with vague smiles. The mail piled up with invitations I did not open and bills I paid in cash to avoid scrutiny. Lisa's dominance grew, her presence looming like a storm cloud that darkened every corner of my days. Yet despite the shrinking space I was allowed, I found moments of clarity and strength. A bird's song at dawn, the soft light through the kitchen window, the warmth of a worn blanket wrapped around my shoulders. These were my quiet rebellions, my secret comforts. I began to plan. Slowly, carefully, I gathered information, saved money from the few gifts I accepted, and researched shelters and community centers that welcomed women like me, those cast aside by their families, but not by their own will. I imagined a place where I could be unseen but not invisible, where my days would be my own and my nights free from whispers and surveillance. The thought of leaving was terrifying, but the thought of staying and becoming a ghost in my own life was unbearable. One morning, I found a note slipped under my door. No signature, just 3 words in familiar handwriting. "We are watching." It was not a threat, but a reminder. They knew I was aware and perhaps feared what I might do, but I was no longer afraid. I folded the note carefully and placed it beneath my pillow, a quiet talisman against the creeping dread. The camera had vanished, but its presence lingered like a shadow. The battle for my dignity had moved into the spaces between words and gestures, into the silences that filled the rooms where I lived. And though I was smaller in their eyes, I was not defeated. The first escalation of their control was also the beginning of my awakening. The time had come to step out of the shadows they cast, to reclaim my voice, and to chart a path toward freedom, no matter how difficult or uncertain the journey ahead might be. The discovery of the hidden camera and the subsequent live stream had marked a turning point in my life, though at the time I didn't fully understand the weight of what I was about to undertake. For weeks after the initial shock and the delicate dance of surveillance and control, I found myself caught between 2 worlds, the one where I was the watched, the confined, the quietly diminished, and the one I was beginning to envision where I could reclaim my voice, my space, and my dignity. It wasn't a sudden decision or a dramatic moment of defiance, but a slow and steady shift inside me, a growing clarity that whispered with gentle insistence that I was no longer willing to be anyone's secret. The first act of this shift came unexpectedly. One morning, while dusting the shelves in my room, I found the porcelain angel again, the very one that had housed the hidden camera. It had been returned to its place, perhaps by Lisa or Adam, unaware that I still noticed every detail, every small gesture. The red light on the lens was gone, replaced by the familiar glossy eyes of the figurine. I held it carefully in my hands, feeling the cool porcelain, the delicate curves, and an idea took root in my mind. This angel, meant to watch and trap me in their private gaze, could be turned into my instrument of truth. I didn't rush. I spent the following days quietly researching technology, speaking to a cousin who had experience with digital security, and learning how to set up my own live stream without raising suspicion. The idea was simple but powerful. I would let the camera remain in place, not as a tool of control, but as a witness. Instead of hiding in silence, I would expose their words, their actions, their true feelings, not through angry confrontations, but through the quiet justice of recorded truth. I set up an old smartphone I had found months earlier hidden beneath my mattress, linked it to a secure app, and began streaming their nightly conversations into the very family group chat where their own hypocrisy was being broadcast. It was a risk, certainly. There were nights I feared discovery, moments when I wondered if I was crossing a line that would irrevocably sever the last fragile threads that connected me to my son and his wife. But the flicker of power that came from telling my story, not with words spoken aloud, but with images and voices unfiltered, was intoxicating. The tension in the house thickened, subtle and electric, as Lisa's smile grew forced and Adam's avoidance became more pronounced. They argued less openly, but their words grew sharper when I wasn't present, and the walls seemed to hold the echoes of accusations and resentment that I could now see for what they were: fear and guilt dressed as control. Alongside this technological defiance, I began reclaiming physical spaces as well. The small garden in the backyard, which had once been a place where I wandered aimlessly under watchful eyes, slowly became a refuge. I planted herbs and flowers, choosing plants that reminded me of my childhood garden, and tended them with care and quiet determination. In those moments, the earth beneath my fingers and the sun on my face felt like acts of rebellion, proof that I could still nurture life and beauty even when my own had been reduced to a mere existence. I found solace in the routine of watering, weeding, and watching green shoots push through the soil, a silent witness to my growing resolve. My daily walks extended beyond the garden gate. I ventured further into the neighborhood, finding little cafes and bookstores where the staff smiled without pity or suspicion, where I was simply a woman passing through, not a patient to be managed or a burden to be hidden. These small journeys were more than exercise. They were affirmations of my freedom, tentative steps toward reclaiming a life that had been slipping through my fingers. Sometimes I paused in front of a window, watching strangers go about their lives, and imagined myself as one of them. Not the watched, but the watcher. Not the forgotten, but the remembered. At night, after the house had fallen silent, I wrote letters I never sent. To my son, to Lisa, to the family members who had turned a blind eye. I wrote without anger or accusation, but with a clear voice that acknowledged the pain and betrayal, and yet refused to be defined by it. These letters were for me, acts of self-recognition and affirmation. In them, I found a strength I had forgotten I possessed, a reminder that my story was still mine to tell, and that I had the power to choose how it would be told. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. I stopped waiting for permission to exist fully and began to move with intention and quiet confidence. I no longer flinched when Lisa's footsteps echoed near my door, nor did I shrink into silence when Adam spoke in clipped tones. Instead, I met their eyes with calm resolve, refusing to be diminished by their disdain or erased by their neglect. It was as if a veil had lifted, revealing not only their true selves, but my own capacity to endure, resist, and grow. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a lawyer, a distant cousin who had learned about my situation through the family group chat. It contained information about my rights, options for independent living, and contacts for support services that I had never imagined could be within my reach. The letter was a lifeline, a tangible symbol of the possibilities opening before me. I folded it carefully and placed it on the small desk by my window, where the afternoon light spilled onto the paper and illuminated the path I was beginning to walk. By this point, I had stopped pretending that this house was my home. It was a place I inhabited, but not one where I belonged. The furniture, the pictures, the carefully curated spaces all belonged to Adam and Lisa, and though I shared their roof, I was a visitor at best. But with every small act of defiance, the secret live stream, the reclaimed garden, the unsent letters, I was carving out a space for myself within the margins. It was a slow and steady reclamation, a transformation from the invisible to the visible, from silence to voice. This shift was not without cost. There were days when the loneliness felt suffocating, when the weight of betrayal threatened to crush me beneath its silent pressure. But those moments passed, carried away by the quiet certainty that I was no longer alone, that somewhere beyond these walls was a world that still held room for me. The camera, once a symbol of surveillance and control, had become a mirror reflecting not my vulnerability, but my resilience. I was no longer the woman they thought they could erase. I was a witness to my own life, and the story was only just beginning. The days that followed my decision to live stream the hidden camera footage marked the beginning of a new phase in this fraught and fractured family drama. A phase where the past came clawing back with a fury that unsettled the fragile peace I had begun to build for myself. It was as if by unveiling their private words and private cruelty to the family group chat, I had opened a door that they desperately wanted to keep shut. And now the echoes of what they said, what they tried to hide, reverberated not just within the walls of that house, but through every conversation, every message, every phone call that tied us together, or sought to sever those ties completely. The live stream had torn away the veil of civility, exposing raw wounds, tangled loyalties, and bitter resentments that had long lain dormant beneath a polished surface of polite smiles and obligatory visits. At first, the backlash came quietly, with phone calls left unanswered and messages ignored. Lisa's tone toward me grew colder, her presence heavier in every room she entered, as if my very existence was a silent accusation against the life she had tried so carefully to construct with Adam. He, too, seemed caught between worlds, his face a mask of fatigue and guilt, his eyes avoiding mine more often than not. He stopped calling me Mom altogether in conversation, slipping instead into detached references like the situation or the care plan, phrases that turned flesh and blood into a case to be managed, a problem to be solved. I watched him shrink beneath the weight of his choices, caught in the storm of his own making. Then came the letters. Not from Lisa, nor from Adam, but from others. Distant relatives who had seen the live stream and felt compelled to reach out. Some were tentative, their words full of concern but careful not to judge. Others were more direct, urging me to consider my options, to think about moving somewhere safer, somewhere where I would be cared for properly. A few even hinted at legal help, at intervention. It was a strange feeling receiving these messages from people who had been silent or absent for years, suddenly awakened by the raw truth that had spilled into their screens without warning. Their concern was real, but it was also a reminder of how invisible I had been for so long, how easily my suffering had been overlooked until it could no longer be ignored. Amidst this flurry of external voices, the internal pressure in the house intensified. Lisa's control tightened like a noose, her scrutiny turning relentless. She began monitoring my medication doses herself, adjusting schedules without explanation, declaring that the doctors had advised changes I was too confused to understand. Meals were replaced with bland, nutritionally calculated substitutes, the tastes and textures of a lifetime erased in favor of dietary efficiency. Adam's presence became intermittent, his visits brief and weighed down by unspoken apologies that never reached my ears. The loneliness deepened, but so did my resolve. It was during one of these bleak stretches that I received the letter from Kieran, my grandson, the one member of the family who had never forgotten me, who had seen beyond the roles and resentments, who still reached out with a quiet tenderness that both warmed and broke my heart. His handwriting was shaky but earnest, his words simple and direct. "Grandma, I miss you. I don't understand what's happening, but I want to. Please let me know you're safe." That letter became a lifeline, a thread of hope woven through the growing shadows of distrust and silence. I read it over and over, letting the softness of his care seep into my bones, reminding me that I was not entirely alone, that somewhere beyond the walls where I was confined was a connection that no one could sever. But the real test came when Lisa showed up at the cafe where I had begun to build a new life, a place far from the watchful eyes of the house where I was no longer welcome. She appeared without warning on a gray Thursday afternoon, her tailored coat stiff and precise, her expression guarded but unmistakably fragile. Heather, the young woman who ran the cafe, spotted her first and gave me a knowing look, one that spoke of past whispers and shared secrets. Lisa didn't enter, not really. She hovered near the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu, her eyes flicking toward me in a silent plea and a silent accusation. I kept my distance, finishing my tasks with the steady hands and calm focus I had honed over months of service. When she finally approached, her voice was low, the brittle edges softened by what I dared to call regret. "Martha," she said, using my given name as if reclaiming some lost intimacy. "Can we talk?" I nodded toward a quiet booth at the back, where the noise of the morning rush faded into a murmur. She slid into the seat opposite me, folding her hands tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with years of unspoken grievances and misunderstood intentions. "I didn't know Adam was sending someone," she began, eyes downcast. "The lawyer. That wasn't my idea." I didn't answer, letting her words settle. "We panicked," she continued. "The flight was boarding. The kids were cranky. We thought you were behind us." Her voice cracked on the last word, a confession veiled in frustration and sorrow. I raised an eyebrow. 8 hours, Lisa. 8 hours." She looked away, silent. "You didn't call. You didn't check in. You didn't even ask anyone at the gate." The weight of those hours, the abandonment they represented, hung between us like a chasm. She spoke then, her voice softer, but no less bitter. "I didn't think you'd leave." "I didn't," I replied simply. "You did." Silence stretched taut, a thread ready to snap. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. "I don't want anything from you," she said, eyes meeting mine briefly. "But Kieran, he's struggling. He misses you. Adam's furious. But Kieran, he's different." I took the envelope not because I wanted what was inside, but because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of outright refusal. "He doesn't need a go-between," I said. "He knows how to call." She nodded, a small, tired movement. "He might," she whispered. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said quietly. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." That was the closest thing to honesty I had ever heard from her. I stood then, emotion heavy with finality. "I'm not your shadow, Lisa," I said firmly. "I'm my own person, and I finally remembered how to be one." She left without finishing her coffee, the cafe suddenly empty despite the lingering sounds of the morning crowd. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft and persistent, washing the streets clean but unable to wash away the years of betrayal. Back at the house, the letter from Adam arrived like a storm wrapped in polite paper. It was thick, filled with angry script that accused me of disappearing, of making a scene by absence, of causing the family stress during what was supposed to be a vacation. Lisa's tears, the confusion of the children, the weight of their pain, none of it felt real in those words. There was no mention of the 8 hours I spent abandoned in the airport lounge, no acknowledgement of the instructions to wait that were never rescinded, no admission that their neglect was anything but a performance of concern. The letter ended with a chilling offer. "We're willing to talk, but only if you're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. As if decades of cooking, cleaning, babysitting, and paying bills had been unreasonable. As if disappearing was a tantrum, not a choice made with a weary heart. I folded the letter slowly and slid it back into its envelope. Joyce, my steadfast friend and roommate, didn't ask what it said. She only passed me a plate of toast and nodded toward the window. "Storm's coming," she said quietly. And it was. Through it all, Kieran's letters and calls remained a fragile thread of hope and love. He didn't judge, didn't demand, just reached out with the gentle persistence of youth, trying to mend what time and pain had frayed. We talked about small things, big things, about the taste of freedom when no one was watching, about the quiet moments that made life bearable. The healing was slow, the wounds deep, but in his voice I found the courage to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a life beyond the shadows. And so the second escalation was not a single event, but a cascade of confrontations and reckonings, private and public, painful and necessary. It tested my strength, my clarity, and my resolve. It forced me to stand fully in the light of my own truth and say, without apology, that I would no longer be invisible, silent, or controlled, that I was here and I was enough. The day I finally walked out the door without looking back was neither triumphant nor dramatic. It was quiet, like the closing of a chapter in a book that had long since worn thin, the pages brittle with neglect and sorrow. I had spent months gathering strength in silence, weaving together fragments of hope and defiance, and the moment to act arrived not with a shout, but with a steady breath and a steady step. I packed only what I could carry easily, a small suitcase filled with the essentials I had learned to cherish, a few changes of clothes, the old paperback I had never finished reading, the letters I'd written but never sent, and a photograph of my grandson Kieran smiling as if the world still held some kindness. There was no grand announcement, no confrontation. There was only the simple, irrevocable choice to reclaim my life on my own terms. I left a note on the kitchen table, folded neatly on a piece of stationery, the kind I had saved for years but rarely used. It read simply, "You should have asked for help. I would have given it. But you asked the wrong way." No explanations, no recriminations, just the quiet finality of a door closing and not reopening. I slipped the note beneath a heavy book to ensure it would not be overlooked, then locked the door behind me, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing like a heartbeat in the still morning air. Outside, the world was fresh with dew and possibility, the sky a pale wash of soft blues and grays that promised rain but held back for a moment longer. I walked away without looking back, each step a small rebellion against the years of neglect, the whispered betrayals and the walls that had kept me captive. The journey was slow, not just in pace but in spirit. I took a bus to a nearby town, then another, traveling on the money I had saved secretly over the years, money that no one had touched or even suspected existed. It was my secret stash of freedom, a financial lifeline that had grown quietly while the rest of my life had been claimed by others. The towns blurred past the windows of the bus, fields turning gold in the sunlight, small clusters of houses nestled under the shade of towering trees, and faces of strangers who neither knew nor cared about my past. For the first time in many months, I felt neither watched nor measured, neither dismissed nor diminished. I was simply a woman moving forward, a traveler on a path she had chosen herself. I found refuge in a small town that smelled of pine and rain, where the air was sharp and clean, and the people moved with a kindness I had not expected to find again. There I rented a modest room from a retired nurse named Beverly, whose sharp eyes and quiet laughter quickly made me feel welcome. Beverly had her own stories of loss and resilience, and in her presence, I felt the weight of years begin to lift. We shared cups of tea in the evenings, talked about the small things, a good book, the weather, the stubbornness of cats. And in those moments, the wounds left by family politics and broken promises seemed to soften, becoming less a burden and more a part of the story I was learning to tell anew. At Beverly's encouragement, I began to reconnect with parts of myself that had been buried under years of care and control. I took up painting again, the slow brush strokes on canvas a meditation, a way to translate the tangled emotions into color and form. I started attending a community center where women like me gathered, not to share grievances or regrets, but to build new friendships, to learn new skills, and to rediscover the joy of being seen for who we truly were, not just the shadows our families had cast upon us. Each step forward was fragile, a delicate dance between hope and fear, but with every smile, every new acquaintance, I felt the strength of my own voice grow louder and clearer. Yet even in this new life, the past found ways to reach out. Letters arrived sporadically, some from Kieran, filled with the tentative hope of a grandson trying to bridge the distance. Others from distant relatives who offered help but asked for stories I was not yet ready to tell. The most unsettling came from a lawyer representing Adam and Lisa, a formal letter filled with veiled concerns about my well-being and legal rights, thinly disguised attempts to draw me back into the fold or at least to control the narrative. I read the letter with calm detachment, the edges of my resolve sharpening. I drafted a reply, succinct, firm, and without apology, stating that I was of sound mind and in a safe environment, that I had retained local counsel, and that any further contact under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I mailed it with a steady hand, a final act of setting boundaries. The climax of my journey was not a confrontation or a dramatic reconciliation, but the quiet reclaiming of my dignity through these simple acts: the packing of my suitcase, the walk away from a house that was no longer home, the settling into a room that I chose, the cultivation of new friendships and new routines, and the firm refusal to be silenced or controlled any longer. It was the culmination of a slow awakening, a gathering of courage that had begun the moment I first discovered the hidden camera and blossomed into a full assertion of self. In the weeks and months that followed, I learned that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the quiet moments when you choose yourself over others' expectations, when you say no to invisibility, and when you step into the light of your own truth. The woman who left that house was not the same one who arrived at Beverly's door. She was stronger, clearer, and filled with a resolve that no surveillance, no betrayal, and no abandonment could ever extinguish. And so, with a heart both heavy and hopeful, I closed the door on the life that had tried to diminish me and opened a new one where I was finally, irrevocably free. The months that followed my departure from that house were a gentle unfolding, a slow and steady reclaiming of parts of myself I had forgotten I still possessed. The room I rented from Beverly became more than just a place to sleep. It grew into a sanctuary where the echoes of betrayal could fade and the quiet rhythm of everyday life could take root. Each morning, the soft light filtered through the curtains, casting patterns on the worn wooden floor that felt like a kind of welcome, a gentle reminder that here, at last, I was no longer under surveillance, no longer a secret to be hidden or a burden to be managed. The days settled into a calm routine, tea shared with Beverly in the kitchen, crossword puzzles on Sunday afternoons, the occasional walk to the nearby park where the trees whispered stories I was only beginning to understand. In this new life, the weight of the past did not vanish, but it no longer defined me. I kept the Livestream app on my phone, not as a tool of vengeance or suspicion, but as a reminder of the moment I chose to speak my truth, to turn their own weapon of control into a beacon of clarity. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I replayed the conversations that had shattered the illusion of care, hearing Lisa's voice crack with the realization she had been caught, feeling the tension in Adam's tired replies. These echoes were no longer chains, but markers of a journey I had survived and grown stronger for. I kept the photo of the porcelain angel on my dresser, the one that had hidden their gaze and had become, in a way, a symbol of my awakening. It reminded me that even in the darkest moments, light could find a way in. The connection with Kieran, my grandson, became a lifeline that bridged the distance between past and present. His letters and calls brought warmth and the gentle promise of reconciliation without pressure or judgment. We spoke not just of family wounds, but of books he was reading, of dreams he was daring to dream, of small daily triumphs and struggles. When he came to visit, it was with the tentative steps of a boy trying to find his place in a changed world, and I welcomed him with open arms, knowing that this was the kind of relationship that could heal without erasing the past. His presence was a quiet balm to wounds that had seemed too deep to mend, and in his company, I found the courage to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. Meanwhile, the letters from Adam and Lisa ceased, replaced by a silence that was both a relief and a reminder of the finality of some choices. I had no desire to reopen doors that had been slammed shut with years of neglect and indifference. Instead, I focused on building a life that was my own, one shaped not by their expectations, but by my own desires and needs. I returned to old passions, painting landscapes that captured the soft light of dawn and the quiet strength of trees standing firm against the wind. I volunteered at the community center, sharing stories and laughter with women who carried their own histories of loss and resilience. In these moments, I found a kind of family forged not by blood or obligation, but by shared strength and understanding. One evening, as Beverly and I sat on the porch wrapped in warm blankets, watching the stars emerge one by one against the deepening sky, she turned to me and said, "You've come a long way." I smiled, the fullness of that journey settling in my chest, like a quiet song. "I have," I replied, "and I'm still coming." There was no finality in those words, only the steady pulse of life continuing, of a story still being written with each new day. The wounds remained, but they no longer ached with the same sharpness. They had softened into memories, lessons etched into the fabric of who I was. Before I fell asleep that night, I took out a blank card and a pen, writing a letter to myself. A message of compassion and strength to the woman who had waited too long for rescue and forgotten she held the key all along. I wrote, "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done. Love me." I tucked the card inside the drawer of my dresser, behind old recipe cards and photographs, a secret promise I could revisit whenever the shadows of doubt crept too close. This was my resolution, not a return to the past or a forgiveness forced, but a quiet acceptance and a courageous step into the future. I had not only survived, but grown, shedding the layers of invisibility and silence to become a woman who stood firmly in her own truth. If this story finds you, if you have felt the sting of betrayal or the weight of invisibility, know that it is never too late to choose yourself. Be your own sign, your own noise in the silence, your own step away from the darkness. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here.